According to research, 90% of execs don't know how to build a strategy, which can lead to failed product launches, lower market share, and even failed companies. Now, I certainly was in this camp. Around 12 years ago, however, I made a decision I wanted to learn how to build and execute a strategy. Now, the advice out there is not great. There are some standout contributors though. You have Henry Mintzberg, who talks about a bottom-up strategy. Gary Hamel talks about an organisation's core competencies and using that to build a strategy. And you have Richard Koch, you may know him from the 80-20 rule, by far the leading contributor in the field around how to build a strategy step by step. Now, I wrote to Richard and asked him if he would help, not knowing that Richard is a billionaire. But would you believe it, he wrote back and offered to help and brought along his colleague Robin Fielding, who had just used the methodology I'm about to show you to turn around Filofax. Now, the methodology starts by segmenting your customer base. You can do this simply by products or geography or demographics. Richard suggests you may have between 15 and 50 segments. In the business that we were in, which was a manufacturing business turning over around 200 million, there was simply 2 segments. So you list your segments, and in each segment you ask the question, are your competitors in this segment the same as they are in the next segment? If there are different competitors, then you have different segments. Now, as I say, our 2 segments were one, a retail segment, B2C, and a wholesale segment, B2B. The next question you ask is, where do we make money? Now, what we find is in the retail segment, turning over 80 million, 19% profitability. In the wholesale segment, 65 million, coming in at 18% profitability. Now, listening to the exec of this business, they were absolutely convinced that retail was where they needed to put their focus, their efforts, and their money. As you'll see as we go through, the strategy model gives us a different perspective. The next thing was to look at our competitive positions. Again, we see retail as strong. This is looking at your relative share against the biggest competitor. Now, 4 times share is a dominant position. 1 to 1.49 on the other end of the spectrum is narrow leadership. So as you see, retail at 3.1 looking very strong, wholesale at 2.1 not so strong. However, this is where the picture starts to change. The next thing to do is look at what's called the growth matrix. This is looking at market growth against company growth. You'll also see that the markers for each segment are slightly different, representing that the B2B is a slightly smaller market at present. However, you'll see the market is growing in B2B, although we haven't exploited that in company growth. But for retail, the market is actually shrinking, even though the company has done well in that segment. Now, if we look at the next one, which is the growth share market, this is market growth against relative market share, telling us the same story, that actually B2B has done well, the market is doing well in that segment. Retail, although the market share is stronger, that market is actually starting to decline. The exec at this stage are starting to see a different picture. The next one is growth against return on capital employed. Now again, we see a different picture to what we thought was going to happen. B2B actually performing well in terms of the capital employed for that business, but retail showing that actually, although their share is good, they're not getting the returns that potentially they should have been against the capital used in the business. Now, the next thing we look at is customers and capabilities, meaning what matters to the customer against how well the business can perform in those different areas. Now, retail was actually doing okay, but what we see is some big opportunities in B2B. And this is maybe why actually the market was performing well, but the B2B business, not so much. Here we see that although there's a good price match, the brand is not as strong, the service is not as good, the packaging is not as good, and the product itself actually is lacking. Again, opportunities. So we bring all of this together, and this is now our strategy. Number one, raising profits fast. Now what we can do is we can exploit the efficiency of the retail business by improving that return on capital employed. And what we can also do is start to think about improving those capabilities for the B2B business and start to exploit that growth in that particular market. Next thing is we then decided that we would nurture the retail market because that's really the cash cow. But we'd give it less ad spend and less focus. And also when we studied the retail operations, what we found is our return on capital employed was poor because we had 2 factories and the supply chain costs were simply too high. So we closed 1 factory and we managed to improve the return on capital employed very, very quickly. Next thing to do was to think about the long-term strategy, and this was really about building the brand for B2B, improving the service for B2B, building some new product ranges in B2B, and as I said, improving that efficiency in retail. So in summary, we had keep retail as the cash cow and grow the B2B. A very, very different picture and different perspective to what the leaders thought before we actually started to deploy the strategy methodology. So in summary, number one, segment your market. Number two, understand the relationship between market growth and company growth in a number of different areas, looking at things like relative market share and return on capital employed. And finally, understanding what really matters to the customer. And maybe what you'll find is, what we find, is getting completely amazing results relies on counterintuitive thinking.